It's nefarious, man. Like, the brain works in fucked up ways.
The mind is one of the most deceiving, manipulative pieces of equipment, flesh, human bodies on earth. I never have trusted my brain.
All of that weight lives in your head, and you are the decision maker.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
Hi, it's Ronsley. If this is your first volume, welcome. This is a weekly series where I go inside the mind of an entrepreneur, artist, athlete, academic, to decipher what is the psychology of our decisions. I'm Australian, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians throughout Australia and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. I pay my respects to them and their cultures, and to elders both past and present of the land I'm standing on today. I extend my respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who listen to this. It's hard to believe we've just entered August. 2020 so far has seen Australia experience one of the worst bushfire crises in recent times globally, spanning over the course of several months, putting the country in a state of emergency. At least 34 lives were lost as a direct result of the fires, including volunteer firemen. Not to mention an estimated 1.5 billion, with a B, animals that were killed as the fires spread across our land, destroying their homes and habitats. With the last of the fires being put out by torrential floods, you would think that it couldn't get any worse from that point on, right? Wrong. Globally, we saw the intense escalation of the threat posed by COVID-19 and the devastating effects it can have on our population and healthcare systems if we don't make an effort to collectively control the spread. Everyone is feeling its effects in some way or another. Yet, there are still those that are choosing to ignore the facts or have been deeply misled by people in power or agenda-fueled media. The information from health experts is literally at your fingertips. If you're still denying the danger of the virus, you're lying to yourself. And speaking of having information at your fingertips, the last week of May showed us how the power of social media can be used for good sometimes, with most news outlets across the globe broadcasting this story.
4 police officers have been fired after footage emerged showing a black man pleading as a white policeman knelt on his neck.
Our North America correspondent David Lipson has more from Washington, but first a warning: some people might find this story distressing indeed.
It is so hard to watch this. It goes for about 10 minutes and it shows a white police officer with his knee on the back of the neck of a handcuffed black man on the ground in Minneapolis. And it just goes on and on and on. At the beginning, he's pleading for breath. He's saying he can't breathe, he can't breathe. At one point, he says, "Don't kill me." And they seem to be the last words that he utters. There are bystanders filming it. They get more and more agitated. They're pleading with the police officer to take his knee off the man's neck, pointing out that he's not moving. They're pleading with him to at least take the man's pulse. Eventually, the suspect is taken away, loaded onto a stretcher and taken away in an ambulance. He's unresponsive and he was pronounced dead a bit later. Breaking news this morning, all 4 officers who actually responded to that case have been fired, as you mentioned.
The video of George Floyd's last moments is hard to watch, but it's disgusting to think that if it hadn't been posted on Facebook, the officers involved would most likely still be living their normal lives today, while George's life was tragically cut short at the hands of the people that are supposed to be there to protect us. Since that story came to light, the 4 police officers involved have been arrested and are currently facing charges over the murder of George Floyd. The incident refueled the frustration and support behind the Black Lives Matter movement and sparked protests against racism and police brutality across America and around the world, some of which are still going on today, and with good reason. Research shows that in America, 1 in every 1,000 black men and boys can expect to be killed by the police. An article posted early July in the New York Times suggested that about 15 million to 26 million people in the United States participated in the demonstrations over the death of George Floyd and many others, including Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain, and Breonna Taylor, all of whom were unarmed. For me, Ahmaud's killing hurts the most because he was just out for a run, and I forget the kind of luck I have that I can go for a run without the thought crossing my mind that someone would pull a gun on me. But the flood of support behind Black Lives Matter came with anti-protesters that went to great lengths to silence their voices.
A man has been shot dead during what had been a peaceful Black Lives Matter protest in Texas. Rallies across the United States have started spiralling into violence, with militia joining some of the marches.
An aggressive car horn, the first sign of trouble. The peaceful march in Austin quickly shattered by gunfire. Screams replacing chants as dozens run for their lives, protesters hiding behind pillars and cars.
Someone got out of their car and shot one of the protesters.
Police are quick to secure the area, finding a man collapsed in the middle of the street. Those who witnessed the attack left scared and confused.
And he shot Garrett. Garrett is the husband of Whitney, a quadriplegic in a wheelchair, and he is her caretaker.
The reported victim had taken part in every rally the Texan city had held. Elsewhere, Black Lives Matter protests are also escalating. Protesters scrambled as a car drove into a rally in Colorado. Caught in the mayhem, police say someone in the crowd opened fire at the Jeep, leaving 2 people wounded, while 3 people were injured in a shooting in Louisville, Kentucky, after armed militia took to the streets. Police say it was an accident as the African American NFAC organisation marched to the local courthouse. But they weren't alone, with right-wing group the 3 Percenters staging a counter-protest. While in Portland, Oregon, nearly 2 months of violent demonstrations are showing no signs of ending.
Not to mention the wave of violent force, rubber bullets and tear gas that have been used by police on protesters since this all started. Police using police brutality in response to protests against police brutality, that doesn't really sit right with me. It's shocking to me that there's 2 sides to this, that there are people that are against equality. It blows my mind that people are using the protests as a way to villainize those who are fighting for change. The video that you're about to hear is incredibly powerful and was made in response to the backlash that the protests received around the world, specifically in America, where some protests got out of hand, causing damage to local property. Kimberly Jones breaks down why the damage caused by the protests is small compared to the damage caused to Black lives throughout history. Since when is property worth more than human life?
Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that Black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built Black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood, how can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the fuck do I give a shit about burning the fucking Football Hall of Fame, about burning the fucking Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so fuck your Target. Fuck your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
How are these people that truly believe that the color of your skin determines your worth as a human? That one race is more superior to another? It's bullshit. And right now, we need to keep the discussion around systemic racism and inequality alive globally, starting from within our homes.
Did you know most Australians believe that there is institutional racism in the US but not Australia? In the latest Guardian Essential poll sample, a significant majority of Australians claim to believe Americans are correct to demand better treatment for African Americans in their society, but only 30% believe that there is institutional racism in Australian police forces.
2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with Indigenous leader Mark Yadika Paulson about how we need to start having more open and honest conversations around Australia's past and the treatment of Indigenous Australians so that we can find a way forward through dialogue. If you haven't heard that episode, I suggest you listen to it. I learned a lot. These conversations can be uncomfortable, but they are an important part of moving forward and making sure we address that the way that we live has been built to benefit white people, and to start coming up with solutions to fix the serious problems and discrimination that minorities are facing around the world daily. A good place to start is by looking at our history. In my conversation with Mark, he talked a bit about the anger Australians feel towards the lack of Aboriginal Australian history in our education system.
Part of the shock that hits Australians is this dynamic. Why weren't we told? Why wasn't this part of our upbringing? Why is it we're finding this out now as adults, things that we should have known as part of the history of Australia?
If we don't have these kind of conversations, then how is the Prime Minister of Australia to know there was in fact slavery involved in the history of Australia? In an interview with 2GB, which is a radio station here, mid-June this year, 2020, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, defended the protection of a statue of Captain James Cook in Sydney, stating that, I quote, Australia, when it was founded as a settlement as New South Wales, was on the basis that there'd be no slavery. And while slave ships continued to travel around the world, when Australia was established, yes, sure, it was a pretty brutal settlement. My forefathers and foremothers were on the first and second fleets. It was a pretty brutal place, but there was no slavery in Australia. Yes, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the actual Prime Minister of Australia. He ended this statement of his by saying, I quote, and so I think what we're seeing with some of these protests, they start on a fair point when they're raising issues about, people's treatment in custody or things like that. Fair issue. But now it's being taken over by other much more politically driven left-wing agendas, which are seeking to take advantage of these opportunities to push their political causes. And, like I've always said, we've got to be honest about our history. We've got to acknowledge the positive and the negative. But I think we've also got to respect our history as well. Here we have the Prime Minister of Australia publicly denying the fact that slavery played a large part in Australian history. That really doesn't seem like the best way to give an honest conversation about our past. In response to Scott Morrison's claim, New South Wales Labor Senator Linda Burney came forward to address that. We cannot achieve meaningful progress on matters such as reconciliation if, as a nation, we are not aware of the historical context of the challenges we face in the present. End quote. Here's just one example of the place slavery held in Australia's history in a report by ABC News.
From the mid-1800s, more than 60,000 South Sea Islanders arrived in Australia to work on cane farms. It was a cheap form of labour. Some signed contracts, others were lured or kidnapped, a practice known as blackbirding.
The conditions in which they came were very slave-like, certainly in the 1860s and the 1870s. And then First Nation Australians were treated very often like slaves.
The bodies of dozens of South Sea Islanders, including a child, are buried at Sunnyside Plantation near Bundaberg, a property owned by the former Labor member for Hinkler. He's inviting the Prime Minister to visit the area.
Scott, come up here to Bundy, come and sit down here at Sunnyside, have a look at the unmarked graves of 29 people. You can't know the future if you don't know the past.
When we come back, we look at how racism affects people throughout other parts of the world and how the media feeds into the misinterpretation of people of color today.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
The main objective of this audio project is to bring together entrepreneurs and creatives who share similar values so that they can find the courage to put out their authentic voice for the right people to hear, which allows for them to make their impact on the world. Every great movement started with a memorable speech. For access to full-length interviews, go to psychologyofentrepreneurship.com and click the button.
We've been hearing a lot about racism in America and Australia, but I wanted to dive a bit deeper and see how it affects other parts of the world. But before we get into that, here's a video by Crash Course defining the terms that we commonly use when we refer to racism.
What's the difference between racism, discrimination, and prejudice? Prejudice is a rigid and unfair generalization about an entire category of people. So what exactly do I mean by unfair? Well, a prejudice assumes that something you think to be true for a whole group applies to every individual member of that group too, with little or no evidence. Prejudice often takes the form of stereotypes, or exaggerated and simplified descriptions that are applied to every person in a category. Negative stereotypes are often directed at people who are different from yourself, which means that people who are a minority in a population are more likely to be negatively stereotyped. For example, two common stereotypes of people who use government assistance are that they're A, African American, and B, gaming the system. But both of these ideas are demonstrably false. The majority of people on welfare are white, and people who use social services like welfare are also likely to need the extra help. But these stereotypes lead people to claim that Black Americans, particularly single mothers, are lazy or untrustworthy. This example is a specific type of prejudice. Racial prejudice. Racism includes beliefs, thoughts, and actions based on the idea that one race is innately superior to another race. Some take this definition further and argue that racism is inherently tied up in structures of power, meaning that racism specifically refers to the belief that a race with less societal power is inferior to other races. And of course, racism can be explicit or implicit. Explicit bias refers to the attitudes or beliefs that we have about a group that we're consciously aware of. But implicit biases are a little bit more insidious. These are the unconscious biases that we have about other groups. While we might easily recognize an explicit act of racism, like calling someone a racial slur, we often don't consciously recognize how implicit biases affect how we interact with each other. For example, a 2007 study by University...
The fact of the matter is, racism and discrimination is a global problem. It will never primarily show itself as police brutality or degrading remarks. Sometimes it's a bit more subtle, but the effects it has on its victims' lives is always ever present. In an article published on DW, law student Keziah Atame Yescott addressed the ways in which ethnic minorities are discriminated against in France, saying, quote, "They want to make us believe that they accept us, but I find that there is a lot of hypocrisy here. It isn't like with George Floyd in the US, where you see the racism 1,000 kilometers off. It's more hidden. In France, you notice it in lots of small ways, when looking for jobs or when you are stopped in the street for no reason." End quote. That same article reads that a survey of 5,000 young men with African or Arab ancestry found that they are 20 times as likely to be stopped by police as other French people. These statistics are not uncommon. In Britain, black people are nearly 10 times as likely as their white counterparts to be stopped and searched by police. In fact, as I read this 9 hours ago, Danny Rose, who is an England and Tottenham defender, Danny Rose talks about on BBC Sports how he regularly is stopped and pulled over and questioned by the police in England. According to Australia Indigenous Social Justice Association Secretary Rahul Basi, Australia's Indigenous incarceration rate is now above that of African American people in the United States. In an article with SBS News, he states that, quote, 40% of the people in jail around Australia are Aboriginal. Compared to the total population, they are probably the people most incarcerated in the world. End quote.
Research conducted by the Pew Research Center shows that around 4 in 10 US adults say it has become more common for people to express racist views towards Asians since the coronavirus pandemic began.
The depths of racism have been rooted into the history and the structures of our societies to oppress minorities and keep it that way. There are people who have been raised to genuinely believe that your race determines your worth and value, both as a human and in society. Since no one is born racist, how did these beliefs come about? There are many reasons that are rooted into how our societies have been built and the privilege that white people now have that puts them ahead of others in many situations. But I want to talk about some of the ways that people of color are misinterpreted in the modern world that stereotypes them into categories, further feeding into the beliefs that some races are more superior to others. Dark-skinned people are less likely to be represented in mainstream movies and television. And if they are heavily stereotyped. They are also more likely to be represented in the news to create fear. We've talked about misinterpretation in the media before, but to further back my point, I'm going to talk about it again. We see it all the time. When a white person commits a mass shooting, they are often labeled in the media as troubled person. But when a person of color commits a mass shooting, they are labeled a terrorist. British tabloid, the Daily Mirror, was caught out fueling this type of racism after the Christchurch attack in New Zealand. The paper was heavily criticized for the way it covered the shooter as, quote, angelic boy who grew into an evil far-right mass killer, end quote, compared to the newspaper's tone on attacker Omar Mateen in the 2016 Pulse nightclub attack in Orlando, Florida, with the story headline reading, quote, ISIS maniac kills 50 in gay nightclub, end quote. Research conducted in 2015 by lawyer and assistant professor Nazida Lajevari showed that Muslim representation in the news had increased significantly post 9/11. She found that in the case of Muslim Americans, much of the information the public receives about the group is disseminated by the news media, and much of that coverage is negative. When the media builds stereotypes around certain races, it causes fear and assumptions which then put these innocent people in danger. In April this year, 2 young girls lost their lives in India due to the hospital's non-acceptance of their Muslim mothers for racist reasons.
India is witnessing racist treatment against Muslims infected with coronavirus and the Muslim medical staff, as recently 2 children lost their lives due to the hospital's non-acceptance of the Muslim mothers for racist reasons. The hospital of the city of Jamshedpur in the state of Jharkhand refused to accept a Muslim woman who was bleeding as she was beaten and accused of having coronavirus. This racist act came after members of the ruling Janata Party, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, announced at a mid-March symposium of Islamic group in New Delhi caused the spread of coronavirus in India.
Similarly, media outlets use the faces of people of color to paint a picture of what they want you to believe are common traits and characteristics among their people. In one example, 800 news articles were examined over a year from popular media outlets such as ABC, CBS, and the New York Times, with topics relevant to the Black community. It was found that when the media outlets examined in the study reported stories about poor families, they chose to feature Black families in their coverage 59% of the time, even though only 27% of families living below the poverty line are Black. in coverage of welfare. 60% of families portrayed were black, even though only 42% of families receiving welfare are actually black. In the same article on the Washington Post, they talk about how black men are highly represented as being more absent from their children's lives. On CNN Tonight, conservative commentator Larry Elder said, quote, "The primary problem with the black community in this country is absentee fathers," end quote. When in the real world, a 2013 study from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention showed that black fathers spend more time engaged in parenting than fathers of other races. I don't know if any of this makes you angry, but it should. So, what can we do? It seems like the most important thing you can do is to use your voice. Have uncomfortable conversations around the subject. They're so important. Call people out on their racist behavior. There's no excuse for that kind of hate. No one gets to be racist. From my conversation with Mark, I was reassured that the power of conversation is important when he said this.
For me, the way forward is to not find the right word or the right statement to make, but to find the right relationship. The relationship that's required is one where we are focused on building and creatively building trust amongst all of us. Enough trust for us to have the open dialogue, so that we can stumble on our language, we can trip over the words, we can say, "Oh, look, I'm sorry about this," and there's enough trust that's been built for us to have a dialogue. At the moment, and even in our more modern, contemporary, immediate context around, if you say the wrong thing, then that could relegate you to an extreme racist or extreme supremacist or extreme somethingist on either side. And that is not helpful for dialogue, and it means that the people who have been spectating will remain spectators because they're like, "Oh, I don't even know how to get in."
We're constantly being told lately that to be not racist is not enough. We have to be actively anti-racist to help push for the change that the world actually needs. I'm still learning. I'm still researching. I'm still listening. From the advice that I have heard, the best way to start making a change is by first looking at yourself. Look at your own values and beliefs and how racism might affect those. Listen to the stories of those affected by racism. Avoid stereotyping races. Don't buy into what the media tells you a certain group of people are like. There are bad people in the world. There's always going to be bad people in the world. But I can tell you for sure that you're never going to be able to tell the kind of person someone is based on the color of their anything, leave alone the color of their skin. Educate yourself on why racism is so prevalent in today's society. There are so many good resources and documentaries that outline how racism came to be embodied in our lives and how it's kept in place to benefit white people. There will be links in the show notes to follow if you need some guidance on where to find petitions to sign or make donations if you can. Keep educating yourself. And remember to be kind to the others around you.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
Coming up on the psychology of entrepreneurship.
I sort of set myself this goal, like I just want to make a company that makes money, as I said, it makes it on its own. You know, it's a creation, it stands on its own, and it's successful in and of itself without myself. If I'm not in this company, what would happen? I'm like, oh, that's what would happen there. Okay, we need to change that process. The competitive edge of, you know, you can either be the first, best, or different. The big one for me personally was a judgment of myself that I was not good enough, where I didn't feel worthy of anything. As an individual, grow to learn about yourself. It starts from there. And I could probably do it better than you can as well.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
This is a Must Amplify production. Special thanks to every guest expert that has appeared on the show. Voiceovers, editing, and sound design by Kaylee Bonnyman. Guest research and content by Claire Gould and Corinne Castles. Project managed by Kaylee Bonnyman. Produced and hosted by me, Ronsley Vaz. For more episodes and where to listen, go to mustamplify.com/POE.
Hey, it's Kaylee from Must Amplify. I'm the sound engineer for this volume of Psychology of Entrepreneurship. I'm part of the team that made this production come alive. I work as a part of a global team with our studios based in West End, Brisbane, Australia. If you would like a podcasting checklist, email me at kaylee@amplifyagency.media. That's KAILI@amplifyagency.media. We specialize in finding your voice and making sure it's heard by the right people. If you are considering whether a podcast is a good idea for your business, check out our other show on shouldistartapodcast.com. Are you still listening? Here's a little gift to you for sticking around.
I don't know if any of this makes sense. No, actually, that's not what I said. Sorry. An assistant professor at the Nazida. Oh, wow. We're constantly being told lately that it's like an intelligence agency not wanting. Never mind that. Scott Morrison's an idiot. I can't do this. Don't put this in the bloopers.